All right. Thanks, everybody. Welcome to another episode of Talking Trout. We're excited to have Paul Cunningham from Wisconsin DNR with us this evening. Paul will be here talking about the new Brook Trout Reserves program. So pretty exciting stuff coming out of the DNR that I think is gonna be of interest to a lot of us in the Trout Unlimited world. So we're really looking forward to having Paul on. And that being said, again, I'll remind everybody, go ahead and drop your questions in the chat box. Do you have questions along the way tonight? And again, for those of you who are not familiar with Paul, he's been helping with Wisconsin Fisheries since 1983, and he's been in a policy position since 1992. Went to school and earned his Bachelor of Science from University of Wisconsin-Stevens Point, where a lot of our natural resources folks go, and got his Master's of Science from The Ohio State University. Says in the late 80s and early 90s, Paul conducted fisheries research for the Minnesota DNR. Came back to Wisconsin in 1992, and since 1994, he served as a fisheries ecologist for the department. So, as the ecologist, he's been the technical lead for fisheries lake restoration, community ecology, biomanipulation of fish communities, master planning of department lands, and land acquisition. Paul also assisted the USGS staff with designing and the function of their FishViz mapping website, which I would imagine he's probably going to talk a little bit more tonight, because it has a lot to do with a lot of the data that they're pulling in for Brook Trout Reserve identification. But and Paul has spent much of his career working on habitat protection initiatives and is now the department's ambassador for the Brook Trout Reserves program. So with that, I will say welcome, Paul, and the floor is yours.
Well, thank you, Mike. I am so privileged to be here. I always love talking to you. It's nice to have a conservation organization that's so mature and so well thought in their organizational structure and input, and I'm happy to be here, and I look forward to it. I'm gonna share my screen, and let me know if it's working okay, and we'll go from there. Can you see it okay?
Not yet.
Let's try again.
Okay.
Hold on. Share screen. Share.
That looks good.
We're okay?
I think you're all set.
Great. So today I'd like to, walk you through really. First, I want to thank some of the folks that have worked closely with us on this project. Joanna Griffin, our past trout team leader, Matt Mitro in the Office of Applied Science, and now John Lyons, of course, is with the University of Wisconsin post-retirement. I really look forward to visiting with you and talking about some of the things we've done related to brook trout management. So I'm going to walk you through an example how we've begun to use large databases and climate science modeling tools like FishViz to help prioritize some of our on-the-ground adaptation strategies for brook trout management. And brook trout face some real climate change challenges. So this is a case about the application of climate change modeling for brook trout management. Well, so what about brook trout? Our Wisconsin native brook trout are an integral part of our natural legacy, our culture, and our identity, and they're also very sensitive to changes in water temperature. Our global climate models indicate that climate change will have a significant impacts on mid-latitude regions such as the upper Midwest, and dealing with climate change will require some of our best available science and some real meaningful participation of public and private stakeholders. the Wisconsin Initiative on Climate Change Impacts, often referred to as WICI, our cold water fisheries working group, suggested that, you know, we take a look and use a triage approach to identify and allocate some of our assets or management resources to only those cold water species that are most likely to succeed. And that could include managing for brown trout in some situations rather than brook trout. The second strategy they suggested was to develop activities focusing on land, shoreline, and water management and in-stream restoration to offset the impacts of rising air and water temperatures and some of the changes we see in precipitation. To give you a little bit of a context to this issue, back in 8 or 9 years ago in 2013, as part of our driftless area streams master planning, I got my hands on an early version of some of the data behind they were developing Fisheries, and I'd call it version 0.1. And I was really looking at assessing stream thermal conditions and trout occurrence. And when I was looking at the driftless area, we see it really varies across the area. And here I'm showing some of the changes in temperature from the current change from out to the mid-century, year 2050 or to 2065. And I'm showing the classified trout water of the driftless area. So the dark blue colors and the blue colors represent these really more thermally resilient streams where July temps are projected to increase the least. And then if you look at some of these red areas, these pink and red streams, they're much less thermally resilient, and their temperatures in their mid-July temperatures are going to increase at least 2.5 degrees in many situations Fahrenheit. And so not all streams are equal, and there's a significant factor in the difference of the relative amounts of stream flow that's contributed by surface or shallow or deep water groundwater sources, deep groundwater sources. And you can see if I turn on my laser pointer, pretty much, you know, here sits Military Ridge. During much of this modeling in the driftless area, the department concluded in the environmental assessments that most brook trout south of Military Ridge and the southwest savanna portions of the state and down in, you know, Iowa, Dane are likely to be extirpated by the mid-century. Now, if we take a look at projected occurrence of brook trout, so that's temperature. Well, now I'm going to show you catchments in that same area. And so here I show projected occurrences, and the red areas are these catchments where brook trout are predicted to be lost completely by the mid-centuries. And likewise, the catchments where brook trout are projected to be stable are shown in black. And the, what's the color? I'm kind of colorblind. It's orange are streams that are risk, where there's 10 different climate models driving this analysis that actually all the models don't agree. And so these are more uncertain situations for brook trout occurrence. And since that 2013 analysis I did, then now we're looking at a statewide picture. And so we've got a full statewide data set to really look at it. And when we examine the impacts of climate change on brook trout statewide, you know, they face a statewide and a regional crisis. And looking at these sobering results points us to the need for managers really to identify and prioritize adaptation strategies for brook trout management in the face of this climate change. When we see our total projected miles of current habitat, and we start to look at the future habitats projected by FishViz, we see our most secure areas in the northern lakes of forest, but still 48% decline in brook trout habitat out to the mid-century. And in the south, whereas in the southeast Till Plain, 91% loss of brook trout habitat to the mid-century. So when we look at these losses and gains across fish species, we're using FishViz. And so what is FishViz? FishViz is simply a USGS sponsored model that projects current conditions and changes in stream temperature and fish distributions in the Great Lakes region in response to the climate change. So here, researchers at the USGS and the Wisconsin DNR and Michigan State and the Michigan Institute of Fisheries Research collaborated to construct these models to assess these impacts of increasing air temperatures and changes in precipitations. And so the FishViz can operate to project future distributions of 14 different species of their known locations, their habitat preferences, and their adaptability to different water temperatures and flows. So the model utilizes methods that were developed by John Lyons, and it includes stream temperature components that were recently refined by the work of Janice Stewart, Stephen Westenbrook, and Matt Mitro. And this report is available and can be downloaded online. And so when we started down this road, and John Pullman and I, when we were working on the Driftless Master Plan, we introduced the concept of Brook Trout Reserves back there. And so we formed a statewide Brook Trout Reserves team, mostly an internal team of department staff. And we came up with this working definition that, it's a selection of some of the places where brook trout have the best chance of enduring the effects of climate change and other environmental perturbations. And it's the designation of these reserves that enables the department and its partners like TU to focus their specific tools to ensure that brook trout remain viable in our state. Essentially, these are the areas in which we prioritize protecting wild brook trout and their habitat. And to do this, we need to put everything on the table for consideration in order to achieve our goal of protecting these populations and their habitat. So we put together this goal statement. The direction was echoed of this goal in our fisheries 10-year strategic plan. These goal statements exist in our statewide trout plan that was recently approved by the Natural Resources Board. And today I want to really talk about some of the objectives of the Brook Trout Reserves. And for today, I want to talk about our progress towards accomplishing objectives 1 and 2. First, how to identify and establish these Brook Trout Reserves. And then for each of the Brook Trout Reserves, identify and assess some of the existing and potential biological, environmental, and climatic threats within the reserves. So I said this was an exercise about climate change models and large databases, and I want to walk you through the kinds of data that we use to analyze to lay out this proposal. First, we had FishViz, and FishViz, the model components were modeled stream temperatures and stream temperature changes and flows and brook trout occurrences, and that's at the reach level all across the state of Wisconsin. Next, we had a metric called fish tail, and fish tail is really this index that characterizes the stream fish response to urban and agricultural land use impairments, and it's driven by really a characterization from the 2006 National Land Cover data set. And then we had our own contemporary data from all our trout survey work. And the data pool here was the years 2007 through 2014. And we were looking at brook trout and brown trout abundances, our catch per effort data from our statewide database. We pulled in all the DNR managed lands layer, our acquisition project boundaries, our public lands, whether they be county, state, federal, our trout class data itself, and a lot of the different department GIS layers. And then we also added, at that time, we pulled in the riparian land use cover from the newest release of WISC-Land 2, and here we're looking primarily at the riparian area. when we did our analysis, we start out with this basic spatial assessment question. What is our assessment unit? And we worked with really the subwatershed as the spatial unit we were going to look at. The USGS created this hierarchical system of hydrologic units, and this is the kind of data that we use in the National Fish Habitat Monitoring Program. And so in the state, across the state, we have about 1,800 and some of these HUC 12s or subwatersheds. And among them, we've got about almost 700, 596 that have class 1 trout streams. And here I'm showing them in the green tones. We kind of put our data sets into 5 contemporary themes, 5 themes: contemporary conditions and resilience to climate change, riparian and subwatershed land use quality, the degree of current protection that we had, and our level of management opportunity for these subwatersheds, competition from non-native trout and salmonids, and some of the conservation genetics that we understood that we had for brook trout at the time. So I did the analysis for the selection, but the team developed all the criteria. And so we sat down and I executed the analysis, but the Brook Trout Reserves team really put together a lot of the criteria. So I'm going to walk you through. I'm going to turn my pointer on. So, we started up here. We said, well, you got to have some class 1 trout water in this subwatershed. And so we set the bar pretty low, 1/10 of a mile of class 1 trout water. And that we had 582 subwatersheds at that point. And then we looked and we infused, we have to have some minimal habitat remaining by the mid-century. And we said, you need at least 2 miles of brook trout water in that subwatershed to be eligible. And so this filter took us down to 344 subwatersheds. Then we sought to achieve abundant populations where there was a fair abundance from our contemporary surveys, and abundance had to be in the 3rd or 4th quartile for that ecoregion. So that took us down to 214 subwatersheds. And then we said, you best not be managing for brown trout. And so if we have evidence of some significant brown trout stocking, it doesn't make sense. And so that took us down to 188 subwatersheds. If non-native salmonids are extremely high in terms of competitive exclusions, we're going to drop those systems. We didn't drop many. We only dropped 3 at that point, subwatersheds, and that took us down to 185. And then by best professional judgment, we asked, did we miss anything? And the fish biologist came up with some, I guess for lack of a better term, I call them mulligans. And they added 20 subwatersheds we thought the data analysis missed. And so we were at 205 subwatersheds. So we took those 205 subwatersheds and we deployed what I call a second iteration criteria. We grouped them together, and they're aggregated to form actually a Brook Trout Reserves. And if in any of those reserves we had no contemporary brook trout data, we eliminated those reserves. After that, we split them apart again, and we said, okay, if non-native trout and salmon exceed brook trout in abundance, we're going to eliminate those subwatersheds as well. And then we reaggregated. So if you look at this map here, you see, you see like the systems where we have, I'm up in Bayfield and Douglas County with my pointer showing these systems where trout and salmon outnumber, non-native trout and salmon outnumber brook trout. And so these stippled subwatersheds we dropped because of competitive displacement of primarily inland brown trout and in South Shore Lake Superior They were Chinook, Coho, Rainbow, and Browns. Where am I? Shut my pointer off if I can. So here I show the map of the statewide distribution of the 54 brook trout reserves that we have formally nominated for inclusion. And don't at this point worry about the color tones on the reserves. I'm going to cover that a little later in my talk. Unfortunately, the lines here I'm showing are our major ecoregions. Unfortunately, we really couldn't identify any brook trout reserves in the southeast glacial till plain of southeast Wisconsin. And we was difficult to find, again, reserves that were south of Military Ridge in southwest Wisconsin in the driftless area. And as a product of this, we created the Brook Trout Reserve summary map book and document. And I'm going to explain what this map book looks like. And I'm certainly happy to make it available to Trout Unlimited. And if you want to put it up on your website or it's available, I'm happy to make it available. But here I'm showing an example of this summary map book that you can zoom into. Now this we identify as the west slope of the Red Cedar. You see the city of Menominee. In this situation, the west slope of the Red Cedar is Brook Trout Reserve 28. It has an environmental resilience score of 37. It is comprised of 5 subwatersheds. Starting off to the west, the subwatershed 1002, O'Galley River and Lousy Creek, and then you move into Katy Creek, and then over here you've got Knights Creek system, the Gilbert, and then the Wilson system with Rush Creek coming in from the north edge of the reserve. And across, for each one, we show the temperature profiles of whether or not the midsummer temperatures shown, the poly lines are in blue and red to show the different areas of the systems and their temperatures. We show the buffers of these systems. So the O'Galley up here has got a lot of agricultural encroachment in the buffer, and the yellow is natural buffers throughout. What you also see is here are brook trout mean CPEs for each subwatershed, non-native trout and salmon, the future forecasts of brook trout habitat, the percent of brook trout miles remaining into the mid-century, the mean July temps on average for that subwatershed, it's classified trout water, the percent of the buffer that's in natural riparian vegetation, the total trout miles, classified water today, the percent of trout stream riparian areas in public ownership, and how much authority the department has as well. That's kind of some of the data that summarize and drives these map books. So among these 54 reserves, we've got these 54 reserves out there. As they're proposed and they're nominated. Right now, then we've moved on to this assessing the environmental and the biological and climatic threats for the brook trout reserves. And here we really wanted to use relevant data to really look at these climatic and environmental threats. And so I approached this from a cluster analysis, and cluster analysis is simply a way we took the Brook Trout Reserve. So we have 205 subwatersheds, which are in those 54 reserves. Roughly, 4 subwatersheds per reserve. I use this cluster analysis to group the subwatersheds that are more similar to each other relative to the other groups. And this is kind of a data mining technique often used in statistical data analysis. And so in this situation, the cluster membership is driven by 8 standardized variables. And I'm showing those 8 variables on the left here now. First, I used that fish tail index, which was an index characterizing stream fish community responses to urban and agricultural land use. We also used predicted mid-century July mean temperature increases. So how much were those streams going to warm to the mid-century? The percent of public land in each subwatershed was our third metric. The future stream temp, absolute in the mid-century, what is that stream temperature going to be on average for that subwatershed? The percent of the trout stream with natural riparian vegetation in that 30-meter buffer from the Wiskland 2 data analysis I did. And then the percent of the trout stream that was adjacent to public land, how much along that creek, the creeks in that subwatershed had public lands adjacent to them. The percent of brook trout habitat remaining from the modeling that we did with FishViz, and the predicted trout occurrence miles for brook trout from FishViz. So those were in the summary, the 8 variables that I used. So the result of this analysis is 7 different clusters across the state. And I'm showing in the state map the Brook Trout Reserve subwatersheds of the Brook Trout Reserves, all the individual subwatersheds. And I'm going to spend some time on this particular graph because the next 6 of the other clusters will be laid out the same. So if we look at, if I walk you through this analysis, the upper left panel is the cluster label number, and there are 43 subwatersheds in cluster 1. And I've included a few kind of like descriptors of this cluster itself. So in cluster 1, the cluster membership is shown across the state in this darker green with a light outline. And cluster 1 subwatersheds, and I show the ecoregion boundaries too in this greenish band as well. And these profile plots then describe the data about that. So with the cluster profile, the dashed line is the mean for all clusters, not just cluster 1, but it's the average mean for all the clusters, and the 8 variables I used in that analysis are shown. The horizontal lines are 1 standard deviation above or below the mean. So in walking you through cluster 1, I could say cluster 1, the land use index is excellent. So these subwatersheds are in excellent health. If we look at percent public land in the watershed, these are high amounts of public land in these subwatersheds. And if they show a little lower thermal resilience. But they're with some above average changes in temperature. So they're above average. They're going to get warmer than most of the other subwatersheds. Great amounts of public land. Their future temps are going to be warmer. Excellent riparian buffers and high amounts of trout stream under public ownership. And if you look at these subwatersheds, so that we call them weak thermal resilience, they're predominantly in the northern lakes ecoregion, the northern forest ecoregion across the state. Now, if I move on to cluster 2, 27 subwatersheds. These are also very healthy subwatersheds, weak thermal resilience. But unlike cluster 1, which contained lots of public land, public ownership in the riparian and the watershed is average to somewhat below average. So we're down here, average, and to below average, really. Future stream temps are above average, so they're also not very thermally resilient. And these are scattered across as well, the northern lakes and forest ecoregion predominantly, and I show them in a lighter green with a bright white line on them. Cluster 3 is now highlighted in cyan, and it's a lighter tone. These have excellent subwatersheds health in terms of their health, and their buffers, riparian buffers, are in great health. There's high amounts of public ownership in the riparian area and in the watershed as well. The future temps will remain somewhat cooler, and the thermal resilience is better than average for this cluster 3. I call these healthy public subwatersheds thermally average, but the brook trout occurrence in terms of future brook trout habitat miles into the mid-century is really excellent. And the percent remaining is high too. We're not losing much from these subwatersheds. And these fall into that vigilant protection. These are some of our best in terms of strongholds for brook trout management. Cluster 4 is average subwatershed health. They're thermally resilient and average future brook trout habitat, but it is resilient. The brook trout habitat that's remaining is quite resilient if you look at the cluster profile plot. And they're going to stay cooler if you look here. And change in stream temperature isn't much, and they're going to stay cooler. And they're kind of scattered across there's a predominance of them in Bayfield County, but by and large, they're kind of scattered across in terms of the pattern outside of Bayfield County. And they're also prevalent in what I call the north central hardwoods. Cluster 5 subwatersheds are shown in tan here on the statewide map. Despite this somewhat below average subwatershed health here and shown here, and these impacted riparian buffers below average here in natural veg, and very low public ownership, lower public ownership, these streams here will remain cooler, and they possess really excellent thermal resilience in the mid-century. Cluster 5 is mainly located in the driftless ecoregion and represents a stronghold among some of the brook trout reserves. These subwatersheds, while they're overall resilient, they offer extensive adaptation opportunities to secure the future of brook trout and improve riparian habitat. So I've classified them as thermally resilient, brook trout strong, but they're private ag subwatersheds. Cluster 6 are private ag subwatersheds, but the riparian zone is under public ownership. So these subwatersheds possess below average health, and yet the health of the riparian zone is above average. And overall, the ownership in the watershed, subwatersheds overall, tends to be private. The future stream temperatures are warmer than average, and the thermal resilience is average for these systems. Cluster 6 predominates the north central hardwood forest ecoregion, and it is a stronghold to many of our fishery areas in the north central hardwoods, the Little Wolf, the Comet, the Caves, the Lawrence, the Big Russia Cree, and hence why they have a higher percentage of public land in the riparian zone. And they are vulnerable, and there are rehabilitation opportunities to offset in among these subwatersheds as well. Now, this is the last cluster in the group, and I'm going to pull this all together, hopefully, into a few salient points. They're shown in rusty brown, and despite below average watershed and riparian health, these subwatersheds possess streams that will remain cooler on average with good thermal resilience. They're more in private ownership throughout these subwatersheds as well, and they're private ownership along the riparian zone. The future brook trout habitat and species resilience is below average, and they're vulnerable, but there are many opportunities for rehabilitation in these systems to offset the ongoing climate change impacts we see, particularly with acquisition of riparian lands or land rights in the form of programs like the Stream Bank Easement Protection Program. So here in this map, I'm summarizing that cluster analysis among the 54 candidates using the results of the cluster profile plots. And so the reserves that are shown in the dark green hold the highest environmental resilience to the ongoing impacts of climate change. There are most secure systems in the state. The light green colored reserves are next in their resilience, but they do contain opportunities to secure and protect habitat. And the reserves that are shown in yellow contain excellent watershed and riparian health. However, their more limited groundwater contribution makes them naturally vulnerable, with limited opportunities really to offset those climate change impacts in those naturally vulnerable systems. And the reserves that are shown in orange are vulnerable. However, there are numerous adaptation strategies that we could consider to those systems that are shown in orange. And this has implications for Brook Trout Reserves implementation planning statewide, these threats and opportunities. So how large are these Brook Trout Reserves in the proposal? Here in the bottom green, I'm sharing with you what these classified or nominated systems look like. So it represents about 22% of all the brook trout habitat in the state based on our contemporary conditions. And by the mid-century, without any intervening management, will probably represent right around 33% of all brook trout habitat statewide. And if we look at what our opportunities are on this, I'm just plotting out on the x-axis is the environmental resilience scores I have for brook trout, and on the y-axis, the percent of the buffer in public ownership. For the panel of the dark green areas of high environmental resilience and high public ownership, here we're talking really about a protection strategy, just remaining vigilant to maintain their status. They don't need a lot of work. We just need to vigilantly make sure forestry BMPs are being applied, and actions like that to offset the impacts of fish barriers, culverts, bridges, and dams, making sure these systems are well connected for fish to move. Whereas in the medium areas, we've got under high public ownership, we have opportunities for riparian reforestation. Under low buffers and public ownership, we have private land BMPs, we have stream corridor acquisition and riparian reforestation. And in the yellow, limited opportunities, achieve realistic expectations. It's more about allowing brook trout populations to move, and eliminating habitat fragmentation may be the most important thing we do in some of those systems. And so while we've put together many of these themes, riparian reforestation will still strengthen thermal resilience. It's at the heart of what the Brook Trout Reserves remediation efforts would look like. here I'm showing a paper from North American Journal of Fisheries Management, Ben Cross et al. From 2013, and they're looking at really changes in average stream temperatures. And when we look at these streams in the north central hardwoods of Wisconsin flowing through these grassland communities, they're increasing about 0.8 of a degree per mile. This is the degree increase or decrease as we move downstream every mile. So the median here is about 0.8 of a degree per mile. And likewise, the streams that are moving through these forested riparian areas are decreasing about 0.25 degrees per mile. So, while the data is only for the north central hardwoods, the principles of solar radiation and shading also apply to our other ecoregions. And this underscores this need to think about riparian reforestation where there's prior, as particularly ag histories in the riparian zones in the floodplains. So we've kind of got a handle on the thematics of assessing the climate threats. We've got a proposal out there for the Brook Trout Reserves. We're really at the stage of now, and thanks go to John Lyons, Joanna Griffin, Paul Pichek, Heath Beneke, Dave Zeibel, Matt Mitro, and our internal team, Brad Sims, Matt Dybel, to working on the Brook Trout Reserves and fleshing out this proposal. We're now moving on to Objective 3, and we've conceptualized this Brook Trout Reserves public implementation plan development. So for each reserves, we really want to develop the implementation plans that are these place-based specific strategies for each of the sub-watersheds within the reserve. So we need to put together the implementation plans of the actions we need to take. We've been seeking funding to hire a conservation planner to work at a local level with our partners to prepare these plans. We're in the process of putting together, a statewide Brook Trout Reserve steering team for many of our stakeholders and partners like TU. The department initiated a America the Beautiful grant application this fall, a request of $4.1 million, and that unfortunately wasn't funded through the infrastructure bill. None of the state projects that were submitted, there were 4 or 5 of them, made it through this funding cycle. We'll see what happens next go around next year. We do have I authored a state budget initiative for the Brook Trout Reserves at $250,000 per year. And I haven't heard word on that yet. And of course, the program we're undergoing our work planning guidance and work planning process for the upcoming biennium. And the program always can think about reinvestments of our existing funds, including Trout Stamp, to more closely focus on these implementation plans and work in the reserves themselves. So with that, I'd like to close. How much time do we have? I wasn't paying attention, Mike. Are we good with time?
Oh yeah, we've got about 15 minutes left.
I'm going to stop sharing. If I can figure out how to do it.
It should be a little button, I think, in the top.
I think did I close it? What do you see? My screen?
I still see your screen, yeah. Which is not the end of the world.
Yeah, there it is. Stop share. Okay.
There we go. Okay. Yeah. So thanks again, Paul. That was
Is my video off?
Yeah. Now
Was I off the whole time?
No, you were. It was just towards the end, I think.
Oh, I apologize.
That's all right. No, we can see your face. I think that was a fascinating, a lot to digest. Fascinating presentation. I've got a ton of ideas like circling around in my head, and I get excited because a lot of this data is out there, and it's a matter of like you said, us, like, how do we use that? How do we take that and like prioritize the limited amount of resources that we have? And I'm talking about like the human power to do conservation, the dollars to actually get projects done and to influence things. And we're going to need analysis like this to kind of steer us in the right direction and say, this is where we're going to get the most bang for our buck. If the goal is to have like native trout for future generations to enjoy here in Wisconsin. So thank you for your work in doing that. I think there were a couple of questions on here. I think David's been thinking about this a lot. I think he's been waiting for you all week. But before we get to that, I was just kind of curious about the fish viz, about that. It is publicly available on a website. Is that correct?
Yes, yeah, it is. As well, the FishViz mapper, the mapping tool. So now DNR IT stuff right now, I have a problem accessing it, but the mapping tools, because there's they converted to Adobe Flash Player, and so I'm having a problem using it right now. I don't know if the general public could probably use it better than I at this point, but I have all the GIS data, all the geo databases from it anyhow as an export, so I can use it in ArcGIS. So but with FishViz, you can, pick your species of interest, zoom into the reach level of a particular creek. Say you're interested in what's going to happen to the Gordon, and will brown trout be in the Gordon by the mid-century? You can look at brown trout. It's not just brook trout, but so FishViz enables you to spatially zoom in and look at the future stream temps and the occurrences for lots of different fish species. Obviously, I spoke specifically about brook trout, but you can look at the other 13 species as well.
That's great. And it's got like every watershed is in there, right? Essentially.
Right. Every when Jana was working on it, you can look at the subwatershed or the reach level, and it's got all the subwatersheds in the Great Lakes ecoregion. So it speaks to Michigan or Minnesota as well. It's not, because this was a landscape level project by USGS supporting all the Great Lakes states, areas. But we were the first to really work with the USGS, and then they got expanded to the whole Great Lakes.
Sure. And I'm not sure if you're the person that asked this question too, but I know I heard John Lyons give a presentation a couple of years ago on this topic exactly, and he was so eloquent and spot on in explaining it. I want to have him on as a guest at some point on this episode or this series that we're doing, and I'd love to have him come on and talk about it. But are you familiar with how the data was like? How do they figure out that like stream temperatures, or are the models figuring out that stream temperatures are going to increase by 1 degree versus 2 degree? I mean, there's got to be a lot of data that goes into that, right?
Yeah, and so the FishViz model, it involves, okay, so it tells you, it'll give you what is current stream temperatures, and for the mid-July, it works with midsummer temperatures because they're very critical for a lot of fishes at their upper thermal limits. So mid-July temperatures contemporary at the reach level, or forecasting to the mid-century as well. And so the stream temperature model works, and it has flows too. So you can look at the flow, because this isn't only about just temperature, it's all about flow too. And so the model utilizes, you'll quickly get over my head here. I'll be beyond my understanding of all. I'm not the modeler. I'm the consumer of the model outputs and all the modeling. But essentially, Dan Weimont and these global climate models, they're stepping them down to a smaller spatial scale, and their ability to work at a very refined scale based on these regional models, they're stepping them down. And then one of the weaknesses in the early models was really that daily the groundwater components and the daily time steps in the temperature model of the stream, because for many of these species, it's all about temperature and flow. And so they, Jana and Steve Westenbrook and John spent a lot of time pulling in a lot more data, contemporary data too, on validating the model with all our thermistors out across the state on streams. So they take real current data to look at the relationships and the groundwater inputs and to be able to predict future. And so if you wanted to, Mitro knows more about the model development for the temperature model components than I do, because he helped build it. And he'll know more than John actually on the temperature side.
Okay.
The earlier components of the model, John really laid out, which was all the land use conditions for the fish communities. And so that landscape level look of predicting what should be there today, it was all John's. And what FishViz does is it only changes two variables, precip and temperature. It assumes a static landscape, no changes in land use, none of the other factors that influence fish communities and environmental health of streams. It's kind of like we fix those in time, which is simple, oversimplified, of course. So, but it really, the model steps in FishViz are really interacting just with changes in precipitation and air temps, and how they influence these streams that have different contributions of groundwater across the state.
Yeah, that's a good point. And it's a point that I always try to stress to my kids when we talk about, climate change or what, just in general, what the future is going to be like. And I'm like, a lot of these models don't take into account like human ingenuity and like our ability to change and adapt and make things better on the landscape. So that always gives me a little bit of hope. The models are counting us out of it, but we're not out of it. We have yet to be put into the data. So
and that's why, we can change that trajectory for some systems, and for others, no.
Yeah.
The die is cast.
Yeah.
On some systems, it doesn't matter. They're cooked. And others, you can have influence where you can remediate and offset some of those impacts by, riparian reforestation is a good example, where you can offset a lot, or allow, like I showed in the statewide outlook, those northeast streams, a lot of them are naturally vulnerable. Well, that means you got to allow fish to move,
Yeah. David had an interesting question. You mentioned the reforestation thing. Has there been any, are you able to like go into the models, and can they, like, can you put in there, like, what if we reforested like 6 miles of this watershed? Like, can we run the model and see what the effects of that would be? Or is it not at that level yet?
Not FishViz.
Okay.
But what we can do is look at like analyses and systems and say, well, what is the projected impact? Now in that process, what we're really trying to figure out too is there's in the departments, we're going to have to pull in on the riparian reforestation, pull in USGS, the department's forestry team too, to say, okay, well, what are the types of species we should be looking at planting, along the riparian zone here? What are, because they too are changing with climate change. And so we have to adapt and account for changes in these riparian zones, climates for riparian revegetation of forested communities. We often are dealing with just natural encroachment of a prior ag disturbance, and so we've got buckthorn, willow, box elder encroachments and all that, because we've chosen not to really accelerate riparian reforestation in these areas. And so they become these little thickets of that are not reflective of a forested riparian zone at all. They're just remnants of prior disturbance. So we've got a forestry team that Carmen Wagner and others, we've given it some thought, but we've not pulled the trigger yet, completely on it, because it's going to differ across the ecoregion. So what, a riparian reforestation in, Sauk County is going to look different than Polk County.
Yeah, absolutely. I think, David, in one of his questions here, is commenting on some of the different species that could be added to the stream banks. And that's, your point exactly, is you can't put the same, one size fits all through the entire state. Like, it's got to be a site specific thing. So, yeah, it'll be interesting to see, watch that develop over the years.
Well, and this concept, we all understand the idea of riparian reforestation has been to some degree antithetical to our projects of southwestern Wisconsin, where we're managing for these sedge meadows, and so aspects about fishability and other factors come into play, because we have a history of actually deforestation of the riparian zones in our active trout management program, which has worked well for brown trout. It's not to say that it's going to work for brook. We do a much better job at understanding how to rehabilitate brown trout habitat, honestly, than we do brook trout habitat.
Yeah.
And so we're rethinking quite a bit of this when it comes to really, brook trout habitat as well, about our practices. And so there's going to be some needs for players at the table to think about this, because one of the things that a Brook Trout Reserve, and I want to stress this, does not connotate, is that these are not areas where we would restrict angling. Some have reacted like, what is a reserve? Well, it's about protecting the reserve habitat, and so actually we may increase exploitation on some of these reserves for brown trout, to remediate competitive displacement. Brown trout are a threat to brook trout in some of these systems, so we're also working on those issues. So other states might call this a strongholds. I've heard that term, trout strongholds. But we didn't want to imply that we're going to restrict angling in these places. That's not even in the discussion.
Good. That's good to know. Yeah, appreciate that. I know one of the other things that David mentioned here was, and you kind of brought it up too, is how we do restoration work differently now, for whether we're working for brown trout or if we're doing things for brook trout. And I think that's something that I've noticed over the last couple of decades. It seems like there's been this kind of sea change in restoration techniques, and it's great to see, and it's really forward thinking. And the example that David gave here is, you think about all these big lunker structures with the big limestone rocks, lining the banks, and you typically associate that, with good brown trout habitat, but that doesn't necessarily translate to good brook trout habitat. And a lot of times they're looking for different things, like large woody debris and bigger pools and that. So yeah, all interesting stuff to take a closer look at, for sure.
Yeah, and unfortunately, in the past, we some of the unintended consequences of some of our habitat projects have tipped the balance in favor of competition in favor of brown trout. Unknowingly, we've done some of this, and I think we've learned a lot through the years about, and if we do trout habitat management incorrectly in these states, in some of these systems, if we do it wrong, we're actually impairing brook trout habitat then. If we tip the balance in favor of brown trout and they competitively displace brooks by our habitat management actions, we've actually caused damage for brook trout. We haven't helped them. And so we're trying to get a handle on some of these brown trout intrusions, as Kent says. Some of them are maybe temperature mediated as well. Browns can handle warmer water. So the trout team is talking about this a lot, and we're trying to be very mindful of this issue.
Yeah. I want to try to hit on I know it's 9 o'clock, but we'll try to hit on a couple of these real quick if we
Sure.
can. And if Kim was asking about the current status of the easement program, and he's wondering if future easement acquisitions will focus on these Brook Trout reserves. I don't know if you want to speak to that at all, or if it's too early to say.
No, it's not. And thanks for the question, Kim. The America the Beautiful grant we submitted, we took 15 of the reserves that we felt land acquisition of the riparian zone was important. And so we were seeking actually funding to implement land acquisition and stream bank easement acquisition with the America the Beautiful grant on 15 of those reserves. And they weren't those, naturally well protected ones in Bayfield County, those vigilant ones. They were secure habitat ones where we identified them. So I think, when we talk about lining our assets up where we're most likely to succeed, it's kind of implied here that we're going to do less in some areas and do more in others that we're prioritizing. And this is about prioritizing our efforts really on the ground to say, here's where we can move the needle to make sure brook trout stay on our landscape in the long run. So yeah, I think we're there, Kim, to be honest. And we're there at the point we should be really talking about, where we spend our dime and because our dimes are limited, and we can't go everywhere and do it all. So it should proposals like this, and that's why I'm so excited to try and get on to the implementation planning side to say, okay, here's this reserve. Now, who's got to come to the table to assist in saying, here's what we need to do? Very, very specific items, place-based items, not motherhood and apple pie stuff, but really specific, a fish passage culverts assessments in the subwater of this reserve, because there's high levels of impairment. And so which ones are we going to give, deal with culverts and issues like that, and land acquisition and easement outreach or whatever. So I look forward to that place-based one where you can hand that document to our partners in TU or land and water conservation departments, say, let's go get them. Let's see what we can do to move the needle, in this, and very specific action. So we're not there in terms of the plans, but some of these practices are pretty straightforward and will work today without a plan. But I'm anxious to get the planning going too.
Yeah, I will say from TU's perspective, we're anxious as well. So I'm looking forward to it. Stephen had a question about you mentioned that area south of Military Ridge in that southwest corner of the state. Is that something, where there's been efforts to reintroduce brook trout, you think? And maybe it's not a question for you, probably a question more for the local fisheries biologist, but do you think they're going to start like pulling back from some of that stuff in these areas? Or do you think they're going to continue to try to keep populations?
Well, I think the Brook Trout Reserves doesn't imply that that populations outside of these areas we're gonna spend less effort on them. But right? we're going to spend less. We're not going to spend as much money on them, obviously. But the implication is, that we're gonna think that this is a stronghold for brown trout management down here. Now, if we have say a small subwatershed, whether it's Vermont Creek or a couple little ones, we've got the one in Iowa County is about our southernmost reserve we've got, but there's some isolated, the Steiner branch in Lafayette County, and there's some small little populations that obviously we probably won't stock on top of them with brown trout, but we're probably gonna, if we're gonna walk the talk, we probably won't spend a lot of money on them either. They won't be our focus. They're not the strongholds that we can really bank on.
Yeah.
And to the area south of the Military Ridge, it'll be a brown trout management area in general. So I don't think we're going to get out of trout management down there. Don't misunderstand me, but I don't think it's going to be the core of our brook trouts restoration efforts.
Yeah. Can we, Ken had a good question about genetics, and I know you mentioned it a little bit in your presentation. Maybe it just give you an opportunity to elaborate on that. I know there's a lot of research going on right now into brook trout genetics, and is that something that's going to be taken into account with the brook
Yeah,
trout
I mean,
reserves?
yeah, yeah, we have I have a shape file all for all the genetics that we know of in the reserves. You know, where are our inherited domestic populations that were influenced, you know, and where now Jared Hamala and the folks at Point we're trying to get a clearer picture. It didn't come in. It comes in more on the issue of wild fish transfer and reintroduction into different areas. So we also want the reserves to be a reservoir of genetic diversity for us as well. So if we have a reserve that has a history of a loss of genetic diversity by prior propagation systems impacts, you know, we're trying to learn which reserves are hold those genetic resources and that can help with wild fish transfer as well. I think for the future of brook trout management, in many ways, it's not propagation systems. It's not growing fish in our state fish hatcheries, even if they're F1 wilds. It's more probably about inventorying our portfolio of genetic resources we've got and utilizing the local adaptation we have in wild fish transfer. Unfortunately, we lack some authorities with Department of Ag to be doing wild fish transfers on a routine basis, and that needs to be remedied. And we've been working on this issue of regaining our authority to wild fish transfer, because we can't do that really without archiving and quarantining fish, and that's a struggle for us. So I think genetics will play a role in this, especially in the future of guiding wild fish transfer if we need it as a restoration tool.
Sure. I will say, within Trout Unlimited, our organization has been going through this process called Priority Waters, and we've kind of looked at the state. Each of the states has been asked to do this by the national organization, and pick some areas that we think that we can. You mentioned the term "move the needle," like where we think we can move the needle along with our partners in some of these watersheds. And one of the things going through those discussions that has come up is the spring ponds in Wisconsin, and they're kind of a unique feature, especially given how, you know, that I think of that cluster up by Anago all the time. That's like one of the most highly concentrated areas of spring ponds in the world. Did you guys look at the spring ponds at all when you were considering brook trout reserves, or is the data just not there yet to that we do have available for the streams?
So I'm pulling open the map. We have we probably lack a complete understanding of the influence of spring ponds on our temperature models in this area a little bit, and I'm actually going into it now, the map, and
Okay.
there's a Brook Trout Reserve 32 is called the Red Embarrassed Wolf. It's a pretty big system. I mean, it's got probably 11 sub-watersheds, and it reflects some of northern Shawano County and Langlade, some of Menominee too. And there's a heavy influence of spring ponds in there. They're a part of the reserves, but I don't think all our temperature modeling it may not be as accurate in that area as we'd hope.
Yeah.
And I'll leave it at that. But
Yeah.
it's something we need to better understand, because that's some of the highest densities of spring ponds we've got across the state are up in that Langlade County area. And so we've called it vulnerable, naturally vulnerable with rehab opportunities, that ID book. And I think I should figure out a way to have your TU folks all have access to this map book to begin looking at this, because it might give you some insight. So I'm hammering and stuttering because I probably don't understand enough about the influence of the spring ponds on the temperature model here, and they're probably not as well accounted for as we'd hope.
That's a
candid
fair
answer. I
Yep.
don't know completely.
Yeah, that's fair. So Brian had an interesting counterpoint to the plant trees everywhere, and this is something that goes through my head too. Is we spent all this time like restoring these prairies and putting the native plants there, and the root systems go down 15 feet and they hold the soil in place, right? So and much better than like a lot of areas where you just have trees. So there are a lot of things like that we're going to have to make decisions about, and there are going to be trade-offs, and it's not just planting trees everywhere is not going to be the silver bullet. Like, it's going to be a tool in the toolbox, but it's going to take more than that to when we look at restoration holistically within our watersheds. And it really comes down to site specific areas, right? Each one's an individual, and it needs to be treated as such.
Yeah, you remember the old fish biologist Gene Van Dyke? I'm sure, many of your TU partners out there, and Gino used to say, Paul, if you're hunting roosters and bumping pheasants and shooting at them, you're probably in brown trout country. And if you're seeing a few roughies, a few rough grouse, you're probably in brook trout country. And it's his windshield attitude. But when the USGS and when the Driftless area restoration models were developed, the number 1 and 2 predictors of brook trout occurrence in the driftless were the percent of forested in the catchment and the percent of forested in the network of catchments above. And so, when you look at these watersheds, you say, well, okay, the ones that are fairly well forested in these catchments are where we're finding brook trout. And so, those are pretty tells in terms of what's influencing brook trout across our landscape. It's not to say that they can't exist in a sedge riparian meadow landscape, but these, and yes, prairies are in some areas of the driftless, the pre-settlement condition was prairie, but now we're into a new world order in terms of what's out there. And so it'll be there when it comes to thermal here, because for brook trout, it's all about temperature. And so, you can go to a ditch in the south of Stevens Point, some of the worst brook trout physical habitat in the state, in a ditch next to a potato field, and find brook trout. Well, that's because the temperatures are appropriate. Not that we want to build that kind of habitat. That's not
right.
what I'm saying. But so
they have the groundwater input that the brook trout need.
Yeah, and so if we can maintain temperature in a sedge meadow subwatershed, and you can maintain temperature and keep the habitat, you may be able to keep brook trout. But the problem is our temperature is not static, and the trends are such that brook trout will be in decline. We've been enjoying some glory years here, and we've been in a wet period, and that bodes well. But
the drought's coming.
And the models are models. There's error about them, but they're the best science we have to trying to plan for the future. And so the one thing about reforestation is, there's a big lag phase. So, it's going to take a while. We don't build these forests overnight, so we can't kick this can down the road too long here. Otherwise, we'll be watching localized populations extirpated. And it's not just reforestation. That's only one of the tools, but it remains one of our important tools that we'll need to consider.
All right, it's almost 20 after 9. I think we're gonna leave it there. Thanks, you gave us so much to think about, and I think we'd like to have you come back on, if you would be willing to come back on and maybe talk a little bit more about the land use side of things, and maybe the stream bank protection program and that part of Knowles Nelson stewardship program and that, if you'd be willing. I think we'd love to have you back on.
Mike, I'd love to join you guys again. I enjoy visiting, and yeah, I'd certainly happy to talk about our land acquisition and the stream bank protection program.
All right,
it's near and dear to me. So
that sounds great. Thanks again for spending some time with us tonight. I'll try to get this up on the YouTube channel this week, and I'll see if I can grab some links to the FishViz maps, and I'll stick them in the comments section on the YouTube page so people can grab it there pretty easily. So thanks again, Paul, for spending some time with us. Really appreciate it.
Thanks for having me. I enjoyed it.
All right. Good night, everybody.